6:15 service, you know that we start with poetry. Matt selects a poem every week, and we start with a reflection on that. I think it's a beautiful way to start. And one of his favorite poets, I know because he selects her maybe the most often, is Mary Oliver. Mary Oliver was, for about a decade, the best-selling poet in the United States. And there's a poem of hers that I always kind of think of it on Transfiguration Sunday. I wanted to share it with you. And it goes like this. I don't know where let me start better than that, actually. I don't know where prayers go or what they do. Do cats pray while they sleep, half asleep in the sun? Does the opossum pray as it crosses the street? The sunflowers, the black old oak growing older every year? I know I can walk through the world along the shore or under the trees with my mind filled with things of little importance, a condition I can't really call being alive. Is prayer a gift or a petition? Or does it matter? The sunflowers blaze, maybe that's their way. Maybe the cats are sound asleep. Maybe not. While thinking this, I happen to be standing just outside my door with my notebook open, which is the way I begin every morning. Then a wren in the privet began to sing. He was positively drenched in enthusiasm. I know not why, and yet, why not? I wouldn't persuade you from whatever you believe or whatever you don't. That's your business. But I thought of the wren singing. What could this be if it isn't prayer? So I just listened, my pen in the air. Luke took his pen and he applied it to parchment and told about the day when Jesus was suddenly and almost without warning drenched in light, and he shone and he glowed, and what's more, he's suddenly standing there with two of what you might call the early luminaries of the Hebrew people who were long since dead. They had been gone for hundreds of years, Moses and Elijah. I'm always unsure of how to preach Transfiguration, because what you might naturally do with lots of stories from Scripture is try to take something from real life that might be applicable to the story, and how the two are related, how the life and the lives that happened in the Bible might be similar to the lives we live today. Good luck doing that with Transfiguration. You're not, anything's possible, but you're probably not going to walk out of this building today and go up on a mountaintop and see Abraham Lincoln and George Washington appear while a voice speaks from the heavens, and as the person you're with starts to glow. That's out there. There's no ordinary, everyday equivalent. It's simply awesome. And what's more, I love the story of Transfiguration because there are 1,000 little details, and that's a challenge too, because I don't think you have the patience for me to go through all of the 1,000 little details over the course of this afternoon and tomorrow, a good chunk of that as well. But there are so many little details of the story that are just gems to be treasured. Like Peter and the first disciples. James and John, at first it's been, they take this long trek up to the top of the mountain. Now, I'm a hiker, and I'm always, this rings true to me, because what happens when they get to the top of the mountain? They're tired. They're exhausted. When I climb up a mountain, it's not just that I'm tired, it's that I'm kind of sleepy. I'll get groggy when I get to, it should be this moment where you look down on the mountain, or down from the mountain and see the world below, and it's moving, and it is moving, but I'm also just tired. I feel like I could just curl up in a meadow somewhere and take a nap. That's what happens to Peter and James and John. But then when this thing starts to happen to Jesus, suddenly they're wide awake. They're not tired anymore. They're transfixed. And Peter, who the thing about Peter is he's just always the master of rhetoric and always knows just what to say. He sees this and he spouts forth this wisdom. Master, it's so good to be here. Like, that's some real Churchillian stuff right there, right? It's so profound. And yet, Luke always writes kindly, it seems. And he makes allowance for the fact that who would know what to say in that sort of circumstance? I dare you to say something better than what Peter said right there. None of us have experienced something like this. None of us would know what to say. You're standing with Jesus and suddenly he starts glowing and two people speak from the heavens. Good luck coming up with something profound there. So it continues, and Moses and Elijah appear, and Luke says they're talking to Jesus. And this part I love too, because a lot of times when I picture Jesus, Jesus is the one who's talking. He's teaching. He's offering, the wisdom that from the ages for the people. And what I love about this is it seems like Moses and Elijah are doing all the talking, and Jesus is listening. Now, of course, Jesus does listen a lot in the scriptures. I just don't picture it that often. But I have to imagine Jesus was an extraordinary listener. Jesus listened to people that others ignored. Jesus would listen and hear things. Sometimes people would say things very clearly, but the crowd didn't want to hear it. But Jesus heard it, and Jesus paid attention. He heals people that no one pays attention to. He listens and responds to people in their need. Jesus must have been an extraordinary listener. And here in this story, it's other people being the teacher and Jesus listening. And what I take from that, and I find hope for what I get hope for from that. I don't know how to say what I'm going to say. Where I find hope in that, communication's my whole profession, and I'm really good at it. Where I find hope in that is if Jesus listens to us, then God listens to us too. Which is probably something we all really need, right? That's something I think most people need just in life, is to be listened to and heard. A few weeks ago, it was Valentine's Day, and NPR was running these interviews of folks who had been married a very, very long time, sort of getting their wisdom. Most of the people had been married 60 years or more. One couple had been married for 71 years. And what the husband said in the interview, I wrote this down when I heard it, is he said, if you want a good marriage and you want it to last, you got to listen and you got to find a way to be heard. He said that's what marriage is it's this space that two people create for one another, where each spouse can feel heard and where they feel listened to. That's the element that you can't substitute. Maybe that's what God is doing here, is creating space and saying, listen in this environment. In fact, it makes me kind of worry, that comment on marriage, because we're not that good at listening anymore. I mean, I wonder how many 70-year marriages we're going to have in decades in the future, because we're all so fixed on our devices and we're distracted. And how are we ever going to have people get to 70 years with the listening skills we have today? But we're losing our ability there. It's a dying skill. We have to be listeners. When Jesus is transfigured, there's this voice from the cloud, in fact, and it says, "This is my son." And then what does it say? Listen to him. Listen to Jesus. Maybe in part because Jesus listens to us. Maybe all the more because we're better when we're listeners. But then there's Peter, and he doesn't know what to say, and he's going to say something, so it's just going to come pouring out of him. Good that we're here. Let's build some monuments. Sometimes maybe it's okay to, if it's okay to listen sometimes it's also okay to just admit that we don't have the words. Back when I very first started out, I was a pastor of a church that also was celebrating an anniversary like we are here. It's our 75th year. The church I was at, it was their 60th. And it's a smaller church. So what they did was they invited all the people in the church to bring a picture of their early days at the church, from whatever time period when they very first began going to that church. or if not that, if they weren't comfortable with that, some kind of picture from early on. And it was a lot of fun to do this because we unveiled this big bulletin board with everybody's pictures on it. And some of them were kind of recent. Some people had only been going to that church for a few years, but some people had been there 50 years, 60 years, almost since the beginning. And you would look at these pictures and try to guess, like, that young face, who could that possibly be out in the crowd of some of the oldsters? And I was standing with this married couple, and they were looking at their picture, and the husband, he just pointed to it, and he said, "Josh, look at how pretty Irene used to be." Oh. I'm just sorry I couldn't ride home with them that night to listen to the discussion. Sometimes you just don't know what to say. Sometimes we're all Peter, and we just start saying things before we realize what we're saying. So Peter didn't know what to say. And maybe the answer is to simply listen and take it in, whatever's happening. A lot of times I think we want to know what to say or some call to action. When something amazing happens like that, we want some concrete way of being able to act on that or comment on it. And listening can be so much more valuable. We miss that because we want to take that action, but maybe sometimes just listening and taking in what's happening in our lives is the better route. In fact, I love the version of this story that Matthew tells, because when the voice booms from the heavens and Jesus is transfigured and all of this, you know what the disciples do in Matthew? They don't say much, but they fall on their faces in fear and in worship. They just sort of drink in what's happening around them. They're just present. And I know in my own life, I long for that kind of experience with God sometimes, where you can feel God's presence sometimes it's in church, but sometimes it's out beyond church somewhere or among friends or family or loved ones. And I understand the temptation of Peter to want to describe it, but I also know, or I hope in my best times I know anyways, that maybe the best thing to do is to just be present in that moment, to listen to it, to take it in, to experience the awe of that moment. We talked about awe early in the year as part of an earlier series, and the fact that we need it. It's a necessary element in a healthy emotional life. And one of the little bits that I never could quite figure out how to work it into that series, but I haven't forgotten it since, is this book that I read by Dacher Keltner, who's a psychologist. And the book he's written is called Awe, the Science of Everyday Wonder. But in it, he writes these great observations of how awe is an absolutely necessary element in a healthy human life. And I love his observations because what I suspect is, if Jesus changed physically in the story of the Transfiguration and his skin shone and all of this, Dacher Keltner would probably tell you that the disciples changed, if Jesus changed physically, the disciples changed physiologically in that moment, because he cites all of these scientific studies that show that when people have an experience of awe or wonder, their whole physiology changes. When we're left breathless or speechless, like Peter and the disciples are, such an experience often causes things you wouldn't even expect. An enhanced immune function is a result of that. Lower blood pressure, decreased inflammation, even temporarily ameliorating chronic conditions can happen when awe becomes a part of our life. And so Keltner, what he says is, he wants us to cultivate moments and experiences of awe in our lives the same way we would pursue good diet and exercise. They're that important. If you eat junk food, you're going to have high blood pressure and cholesterol. If you eat healthy, it's going to be a little lower, and you try to manage it, it's going to be a little lower. In the same way, if you cultivate awe into your own life, you'll be healthier and more whole for it in ways that are measurable. That's the gift that Jesus gives the disciples as he brings them to a moment where they can see how big and wide and grand God's world is on a mountaintop. There are places we can go for that. Of course, places of worship. Places where we open our soul and we hold it out to God and trust that God is there with us too. You can go seek the grand wonders of creation. Be out in nature. See how big and expansive our world is and experience it. We can experience it sometimes even in the midst of human creation if it's something that feels bigger than us, like the pyramids of Giza, or if you walk through an art museum and you see the works of some great master. And of course we see it in the big places of life, like life and death and the things that make us just get a sense of hush from the bigness. It brings the bigness of life into our little busy lives. And curiously, Keltner says, if those are the things we need in life, if those things are good for us, it is surprising because you would think that we would order our lives around the pursuit of those things, but instead we pursue very small things. He interviewed people in 26 different cultures all around the world, thousands of interviews. And he said that across the board, people spoke very reverently of experiences of awe. But he said, out of thousands of people in dozens of cultures on 6 continents, it was amazing to me, not one person said that they had an experience of awe when it came to money. It's weird how that works, right? Not one person in 26 cultures said they felt a sense of awe when they would look at their investment account or their bank account. No one said that their cell phone or an app gave them a sense of awe, or a TV show that they binged, or their social media. And yet, what do we obsess over? What do we do and what do we strive and work for? In our advanced, enlightened, modern, high-tech, educated state, how did we lose track so badly? And let me close there, sort of with an observation from another book that I recently read, and I love this book too. This book has lots of short sentences and pictures in it, so it was more my speed. And a book called Subpar Parks by Amber Scher. And this was one that I picked up at a national park when I was visiting it last year, or a couple of years ago. And Amber Scher is a national park enthusiast, and she noticed, because she writes on the national parks, she noticed that on travel review websites, people would give some of the dumbest and most self-centered reviews of national parks, things that you would be surprised that people would say about national parks. When we go to national parks, we often see amazing things, right? And so she decided to write this book called Subpar Parks to highlight these weird and dumb reviews. She noticed, for instance, that one review for Yosemite National Park, where El Capitan and the Half Dome jut out from the Yosemite Valley, framing the natural beauty of that place. And one person's review said, "Trees block the view, and too many rocks are just gray." Bunch of boring gray rocks at Yosemite. She found on the review page for Denali National Park in Google Reviews, where Denali has the tallest peak in North America. By some measures, if you measure from the ocean floor up, it's the tallest peak in the world. She noticed that one of the reviews said that it's just a barren wasteland of tundra, and that they had just seen one fleeting glimpse of only one bear. I guess that makes Denali unbearable? Dave, sorry, don't laugh at that. Dave Ring gave me that joke, but I had to use it. Thanks for being a good sport, Dave. For our own local park, Carlsbad Caverns National Park, a reviewer had written that it was just poorly lit and just plain. Like, get some art hanging in those caverns and maybe a tasteful sconce or two. At Arches, I was at Arches last month in southeast Utah, and you go there and you see the Delicate Arch, which holds up hundreds of tons of solid rock, and it just looks like it floats in the air. And one reviewer said it looks nothing like the license plate. It seems, and national parks aren't for everybody, I get that, but it seems that the thing that Jesus wanted to show the disciples, a sense of splendor, the divine goodness of the world and care in the world, what Jesus wanted to illustrate is our problem too. I mean, is it any wonder that we find ourselves in a spiritual crisis in our culture when the natural beauty that God gives us is so joylessly described? saying things like miles and miles of nothing and cell phone signal is impossible, as was described of the Everglades, where when I was in the Everglades, I saw a dozen different scary but cool-looking snakes and a dozen alligators along the way. You quickly realize the parks aren't the problem. We're the problem. And similarly, maybe God is not the problem in our modern world. You know, people say that religion and spirituality, it's on decline in the West, and people blame it on the fact, we're a more scientific, enlightened, cosmopolitan, educated people. Of course we weren't going to believe in that superstition. Do we seem more scientific? Go on the internet and notice how many people believe that COVID was caused by 5G and that the Denver airport is a secret base for the Illuminati. We're not a scientific people. We're not a scientific people. We are a distracted people, but we're not a scientific people. And that says more about us than it does the world that God gave us. Same in our spiritual lives. When God isn't entertaining enough, that's not on God. That's on us. So can we spend some time today in this place remembering this story with Peter and James and John on the mountaintop, and picture that. How amazing that must have been to see Jesus lifted up and changed, and a voice speaking from the heavens lovingly about him. This is my son. Listen to him. I just don't think we're listening very well. But if we tuned our ears, we'd hear. We'd listen. So let us pray. Gracious God, we make ourselves busy with so many petty little things, little tin pot kingdoms that we build for ourselves. And that's okay. We just don't want them to crowd out the deep, beautiful, eternal goodness that you sow into the world all around us. We're thankful for that. Amen.